The click of that lock is what got me. Not the conversation we'd had an hour earlier. Not the fact that she'd asked me to stay in the first place when her apartment was 7 minutes from mine. Not even the way she'd avoided eye contact while she poured the wine. Just that sound. Small, definite, and completely impossible to unhear from where I was standing in her hallway with a throw pillow under one arm and a face full of confusion. It was the kind of sound that made a man stand very still and ask himself some very uncomfortable questions about what exactly he thought he was doing with his life. My name is Jackie Callahan. I was 31, worked in commercial real estate financing, and had been best friends with Mara Hendricks for going on 6 years. I knew her coffee order, her terrible taste in reality television, the name of the stuffed bear she still kept on her bookshelf from childhood and refused to apologize for. I had helped her move twice, once in the rain. I had sat beside her at her father's funeral. I had driven 4 hours round trip on a Tuesday night because she texted that her apartment felt too quiet and she didn't want to be alone with it. And standing in her hallway at 11:30 on a Friday, holding a decorative pillow that smelled like lavender, I realized I had no reasonable explanation for why that locked door had just knocked the air out of me. So let me start from the beginning, because the beginning is important, and I did not understand that until much later. The week before had been rough for Mara. Not catastrophically rough, not the kind of week that required phone calls and emergency drives, just the slow grinding kind, where everything went slightly wrong in ways too small to justify being upset about, which somehow made it worse. Her work project got restructured. Her landlord raised her rent by an amount she described as aggressively insulting. The person she'd been casually seeing for about 2 months sent her a text that started with the phrase, "I think we both know," and ended with him not even getting the grammar right, which she said was almost more offensive than the content. She called me on Thursday night while I was making dinner and told me all of it in the order it happened, which was how Mara always told stories. She had a precise memory for sequence. I stood at my stove and listened without interrupting, which was also how things went between us. She talked. I listened first and then said the thing she actually needed to hear, as opposed to the thing that would make her feel better for 10 minutes and worse by morning. I asked her what she wanted to do about the weekend. She said she didn't know. I said I could come over Saturday. We could order food and watch something terrible and not make it a big thing. She said that sounded good. I said okay. She said okay. That was the plan. Clean, simple, nothing that needed analysis. Then Saturday happened. I got to her apartment around 7 with 2 bags of takeout from the Thai place she liked on Clement Street and a 6-pack that neither of us was going to finish. Mara opened the door in sweatpants and a navy pullover with a small paint stain near the collar that had been there since I'd known her. She looked tired in the specific way she got when she had been spending energy holding herself together around other people all week and was finally somewhere she didn't have to. She looked at the bags in my hands. "You got the noodles?" "I always get the noodles." She stepped aside to let me in. "You're my favorite person right now. You say that every time I show up with food." She closed the door behind me. "That's because it's always true when you show up with food." Her apartment was warm and a little dim. She had the small lamp on in the corner, the one she'd found at a thrift store, and reupholstered herself. The one I had carried up 3 flights of stairs, because the elevator had been broken that particular Saturday, and she hadn't trusted a moving company not to scratch it. Candles on the coffee table, not in a romantic way, in a this is how she relaxed way. She burned them constantly. Her place always smelled like cedarwood and something faintly citrus. We ate on the couch with our containers on the coffee table and a documentary about competitive deep-sea diving playing on the television, which was Mara's choice. She had a thing for documentaries about extreme sports, not because she had any interest in doing any of them, but because, as she once explained to me, watching other people do terrifying things from the total safety of her sofa was the closest thing to an adrenaline rush she was willing to budget for. For the first hour, everything was exactly like it always was. She made commentary. I responded. She stole from my container, even though she had ordered the same thing, and pretended she didn't know she was doing it. I moved my container 2 inches to the left without saying anything, which she ignored. At some point, she tucked her feet under her on the cushion, and her shoulder ended up leaning into mine, and neither of us adjusted. That part also was normal. We'd always been physically comfortable around each other in the way that some friends are, the way you stop noticing personal space after enough years of sitting in the same spaces. I had thought nothing of it for a long time. I was thinking about it now, which was already a change I couldn't fully explain. Around 9, the documentary ended, and Mara reached for the remote with the loose intention of finding something else. She scrolled for about 4 minutes without pecking anything, which was a thing she did when she was actually thinking about something other than television. I waited. She put the remote down. She said, "The guy texted me again today." I looked at her. Today was Saturday. I thought he already sent the breakup text. He did. Today's text was to explain the breakup text. I stared at the blank screen. Did the second text make the first one better? No. She picked at the edge of her sleeve. It made it more grammatically correct, but not better. I thought about what to say. She had dated this guy, whose name was Brandon, for about 8 weeks. She had not been in love with him. She had told me as much around week 5 while we were walking through a farmer's market, and she was comparing 2 identical bunches of kale. She said he was fine. She said fine, with the particular tone that meant she was trying to convince herself the word was enough. But I think it still stings, I said, even if he wasn't the one. She looked at the wall. Yeah, which part? She thought about it for a second. Mara always actually thought about questions, instead of answering from whatever feeling was closest to the surface. That was one of the things about her I had never managed to stop noticing. The part where I keep ending up here, she said. Not this apartment. I mean this place. Another person who seemed okay on paper and turned out to be somebody I just ran out of reasons to keep trying with. That sounds exhausting. It is. She looked at her hands. I'm getting tired of my own dating pattern, Jake. Like, I can see myself making the same choices, and I don't know how to want something different when I don't know what different looks like. I said, "Do you know what you're actually looking for?" She laughed once, short and quiet. I think that's exactly the problem. After that, things got a little quieter, not in a heavy way, more like we had covered the real territory and were both sitting with it without needing to fill the air. Mara poured more wine. I finished mine. She put on a show, something light, the kind of thing neither of us would remember the name of tomorrow, and we sat together in the warm, dim light of her living room while the city did whatever the city did outside her windows. Around 11, she got up to put the containers away, and I started stacking the bottles by the door the way I always did before I left. Then she said something I had not been expecting. "Jake," she said from the kitchen, "do you want to just stay tonight?" She said it with her back to me, rinsey container, in the sink. It's late, and parking's going to be a nightmare, and I have a guest room. And you slept here before anyway. I stood in the living room holding 2 empty beer bottles. She wasn't wrong about any of those things. I had slept on her couch once when we'd stayed out too late, and once in the actual guest room 2 years ago when I was in between apartments for a week. The drive wasn't long, but it wasn't nothing. And it was true that the Friday night parking situation near my building required a level of patience I did not always have at 11 p.m. So I said, "Yeah, sure, if you don't mind." She turned off the sink. "I don't mind." She still wasn't looking at me. "There's an extra toothbrush in the guest bathroom," she said. "The little sealed ones. The guest room closet has blankets." I said, "Okay." I tossed the bottles in the recycling. Mara said goodnight with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes in the way her smiles usually did, and I thought nothing of it. I thought it was residual Brandon sadness. I thought it was the week catching up with her. I thought she was tired. Then she walked down the hallway, went into her room, and I heard the door close. And then I heard the lock. I stood there for a second, then another second, just long enough for the sound to arrange itself in my brain into something I could look at directly. She had locked her door. Not the guest room, her room. Now people lock their bedroom doors at night. That is a perfectly normal and unremarkable thing to do. I knew that. Mara lived alone, and she was entitled to lock whatever door she wanted, for whatever reason she wanted, including no reason at all. None of this required explanation, except she had not locked it before. Not in 6 years of me being in this apartment at all hours, for all kinds of reasons. I had never once heard that particular click at the end of a night. Not when I slept on the couch. Not when I was in the guest room. Not when I'd been here past midnight on a dozen different occasions. The apartment had an open, easy kind of atmosphere. She didn't lock things unless she was leaving for more than a day. I was standing 9 feet away. I walked to the guest room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and tried to figure out what I was actually feeling. Not what I was supposed to feel. Not what the rational version of me would tell a friend to feel in this situation. What I actually felt. The honest answer was uncomfortable, because the honest answer was not confusion. Not quite. It was something closer to being suddenly aware that I had been in the middle of a sentence I hadn't realized I was reading. I lay back on the bed with my arms behind my head and stared at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet. Outside, a car went past and its headlights swept across the ceiling in a slow arc. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. The city went on doing its thing, and I lay there in the blue-gray dark of Mara Hendrix's guest room, feeling like a man who had been handed a map to a place he didn't know he was trying to find. 6 years is a long time. Long enough to learn someone in a way that becomes its own language. Long enough for the small things to stop being small and start being the whole vocabulary of a relationship that doesn't have a clean name. I thought about what she had said earlier. I keep ending up here. Not this apartment. This place. The place where she ran out of reasons to keep trying. I thought about how she'd asked me to stay, and then looked away while she asked. I thought about every time I had driven across the city because she needed someone, and I happened to be the person she called. Not out of duty, never out of obligation, because I wanted to be there, because her apartment with the thrift store lamp and the cedarwood candles and the stuffed bear on the bookshelf felt like a place I didn't need a reason to be. I had called that friendship. It had the shape of friendship. It had all the right edges. But lying there, in the dark, I was being forced to ask whether friendship was actually the whole picture, or whether I had been using it as a safe answer to a question I wasn't ready to look at. My brain said, this is not the time. My brain was correct. My brain also noticed that the question did not really care about the time. I fell asleep around midnight, which says something about either my emotional maturity or my ability to compartmentalize. I have not decided which. In the morning, the apartment smelled like coffee before I was fully awake. That was a Mara thing. She was up early, always, even on weekends, even after late nights. She made coffee the moment her feet hit the floor, the way some people check their phones. I had always considered it a character quirk. That morning, I noticed it felt like something I would miss if it were gone, which was a different kind of noticing entirely. I came out of the guest room in yesterday's clothes because that was the situation I had signed up for by agreeing to stay without any of my own things, and found her at the counter with 2 mugs already out. She looked up when I came in. Her hair was down, which was unusual. She usually pulled it up first thing. She was wearing a different sweater than last night, a gray one, and she was holding her own mug with both hands the way she did when she was paying careful attention to something that wasn't the mug. "Morning," she said. She held one of the mugs toward me. "Morning." I took it, thank you. The coffee was good, which it always was, because Mara had extremely specific opinions about coffee that I had stopped questioning somewhere around year 2. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, not saying much. The apartment had a different quality in the morning, lighter and more ordinary. The candles were cold. The takeout smell had faded. Sunday morning in someone else's kitchen has its own particular atmosphere, and this one felt careful, like both of us were moving around something without naming it. I said, "Eventually you locked your door last night." She looked at me. Her hand stayed still on the mug. "Yeah," she said. I waited. She looked at the counter. "I wasn't sure you were going to stay," she said. "And then I asked you to, and you said yes, and I panicked." I stared at her. "You panicked. Why did you panic?" She looked up. "Because I asked you to stay, because I wanted you to stay. Not just," she paused, "not just as a practical thing. And then you said yes, and I walked down the hallway, and I couldn't figure out whether I had said something or whether you knew something. And I didn't know what to do with all of that, so I locked the door." I set my mug down on the counter very carefully. Mara was watching me with the expression she used when she was trying to read the room, and the room was being uncooperative. I said, Mara, what do you mean you wanted me to stay? She looked away first. I mean what I said. She swallowed once. I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while, and every time I get close to it, I find some other thing to do with my mouth instead. Like talk about kale or documentaries or whatever. She let out a breath. I am very tired of finding other things to do with my mouth. I had nothing immediately useful to say to that. My brain was doing the thing where it lays out several possible responses and rejects each one faster than I can form the words. She kept going, because that was also a Mara thing. Once she started, she didn't stop. Not from bravery, but from the knowledge that stopping in the middle was worse than finishing. I know we've been doing this for years, and it works, and I'm not trying to blow that up. I need you to know I'm not trying to blow anything up, but I also kept ending up on dates with people who were fine and calling you to tell you about it afterward. And at some point in the last year, I started wondering why I was always more interested in the conversation with you than I ever was in the date itself. She looked at her hands, and I didn't know what to do with that either. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Sunday was happening without us. A neighbor's dog barked once and went quiet. The refrigerator made a small humming sound. I said, Mara. She looked at me. Her eyes were very steady, which was her version of terrified. I said, I drove 4 hours round trip on a Tuesday night because you texted that your apartment felt too quiet. Her expression shifted by about half a degree. I know. I said, I have made that drive for a lot of reasons. I told myself it was because you're my best friend, and that's what you do for people who matter to you. I believed that. I don't think I was lying to myself exactly, but I think I was leaving something out. She didn't move. I think when you locked that door last night, I felt something I didn't have a clean name for, and I've been lying in your guest room trying to figure out what to do with it. Mara looked at me for a long second. Then she said, very quietly, what did you come up with? I looked at her standing in her kitchen in a gray sweater with her hair down and 2 coffee mugs and 6 years of evidence that I had been circling a truth I wasn't brave enough to walk toward. I said, I came up with the fact that I have been calling something friendship because it was safer than calling it what it actually was. Her breath came out slowly. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a second, not because she was about to cry, because she was making sure the next thing she said was the right thing. That was a Mara move. I knew it well. She said, that is inconveniently late. I laughed. It came out softer than I expected. I know. She looked down at the counter, then back up. I've been talking to you about other people for years, Jake. About Brandon and the guy before Brandon and the guy before him. Were you? She hesitated. Were you bothered by that? I thought about how to be honest without being dramatic about it. Yes and no, I said. I didn't know I was bothered until I started paying attention to why I was so thorough about pointing out everything that was wrong with all of them. Her eyes widened just a fraction. Were you sabotaging my relationships? I held up one hand. I was being honest. They were all, objectively, not right. The Brandon grammar thing was a real issue. It was a genuine red flag. She almost smiled, but I felt it. That small, familiar shift between us where the weight of something serious found a joke to lean against and breathed a little easier. Then her face went quieter again. I asked you to stay last night because it was the closest I could get to saying something I've been afraid to say. She looked at the mug in her hands. I thought maybe if you were here in the morning, it would be easier. Like, if we had coffee and it felt like something, then maybe it would be easier to find the words. I said, and then you locked the door. She groaned. I know, I panicked. I said that. Mara, I am a deeply consistent person. I picked up my coffee. The mug was warm in both hands. Outside, the sun was doing something kind to the light coming through her windows, and her apartment looked the way. It always looked, but different in the way. Things look when you've finally admitted what you're actually seeing. I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me directly. She straightened slightly. Okay. Is this something you've been thinking about for a long time, or is it a Brandon hangover? That landed exactly the way I meant it to, which was not cruel, but honest enough to matter. Mara looked at it for a second. Then she said, it's not a Brandon hangover. I figured that out around week 3 with Brandon. She set her mug down. I started comparing him to you week 3, and that's when I realized I had a problem. Week 3 was 5 months ago, I said. Yes, you've been sitting on this for 5 months? I've been sitting on it for longer than that, she said. 5 months was just when it became impossible to keep calling it nothing. I set my mug down beside hers. We were both standing at her kitchen counter on a Sunday morning with 6 years between us and a locked door from the night before and the particular terrifying clarity that comes when two people run out of places to hide at the same time. Write in the comments, was Mara right to lock that door instead of just saying something? Or do you think sometimes the almost move says more than the words would have? I said, I'm not good at this part. She looked at me. The beginning part? The part where I have to say something and mean it, and there's no joke to fall back on when it gets too real. Her voice softened. You already said the real thing, Jake. What did I say? That you've been calling something friendship because it was safer. She held my gaze. That was the real thing. The kitchen had gone very still. I could hear both of us breathing, which sounds like a small detail but wasn't, because it meant the world had gotten very quiet around this particular moment, just the two of us and the coffee going lukewarm on the counter, and 6 years of Tuesday night drives finally making complete sense. I took one step sideways, closing the gap between us that wasn't large to begin with. She didn't move away. I said, I'm not going to ruin anything. I know, she said. I wouldn't have locked the door last night if I thought you were the kind of person who ruins things. That made me stop. You locked the door because you trust me? She tilted her head very slightly. I locked the door because I needed to be sure I was choosing this. Not because I was sad about a bad text message. Not because you were convenient and kind and already here. She looked at me with those careful, direct eyes of hers. I needed to sleep on it and wake up and still want to say it. And then I wanted coffee first. She looked briefly at the mug. The coffee was important. I said, obviously, the coffee was important. She smiled. The real one this time. The one that reached everything. I said, for the record, I'm going to be very smug about the fact that you had to lock a door and have coffee before you could admit this. She narrowed her eyes. I thought you said you weren't good at the part without jokes, I said. I'm trying to adapt. She looked at me for a second. Then she said, you know we're going to have to completely re-examine 6 years of conversations. I said, that sounds like a lot of work. It is, she agreed. Some of them are going to be embarrassing in retrospect. I can handle embarrassing. She breathed out slowly, and some of the last tension in her shoulders moved. She lifted her coffee mug again. Then there's the matter of your sister, she said. What about my sister? My sister, I said, has been telling me for 3 years that there's something wrong with how often I drive across town for someone who is just my best friend. Mara looked into her coffee. What did you say when she said that? I said she was imagining things. Mara said, do you think she's going to be insufferable when she finds out she was right? I said, she is already insufferable. This will give her material for the next decade. Mara started laughing, and I started laughing, and for a minute, we just stood there in the kitchen, laughing about my sister having been right for 3 years, while we both pretended she wasn't. And the laughter felt exactly like it always had between us, except there was something else underneath it, now, that wasn't hiding anymore. Something that had been there long enough that when we finally let it surface, it didn't feel new. It felt overdue. We had coffee at the counter, and then a second cup at her small table by the window, the one she usually covered with mail and notebooks and whatever book she was reading. She had cleared it, I noticed, not spotlessly, but cleared, which meant she had been thinking about this morning before last night, which meant the locked door had nothing to do with running away, and everything to do with making sure. She told me about the moment she knew. Not week 3 with Brandon, but the moment she understood it wasn't just comparison. It was a night in March, she said. We had been on the phone, and I had made her laugh about something that had made me frustrated enough to call her first, and somewhere in the middle of it, she had realized that the way she felt on the other end of that phone was the thing she kept measuring every other person against. She said it out loud to the kitchen table instead of to me because even now some truths were easier to aim at a slightly different angle. I said, the night in March when you called me. She said, you remember it? I said, You called at 11, and we talked until past 1 in the about something that started as work frustration and became a conversation about whether people fundamentally change or just develop better coping strategies for who they already are. She stared at me. You remember the topic? I said, Mara. I remember most of our conversations. She put her mug down. Her expression had something in it I hadn't seen before, or hadn't let myself see. Not surprised exactly. More like a piece of something clicking into alignment. Said, I have a very good memory. She said, or you were paying attention. I said, both. We went on a walk that afternoon, not because either of us decided we should, because after enough coffee and honesty, the apartment needed to breathe, and so did we. We walked through her neighborhood, which was the kind of neighborhood that had good light in October, and coffee shops with mismatched chairs and bookstores that looked like they had been there for decades, which some of them had. We walked close enough that our shoulders touched every few steps. Neither of us moved away. That was the change, not dramatic, not announced, just the absence of the small adjustment we had always made before. She said, this feels different. I said, it's different good. She thought about it. Because she always actually thought about it. She said, yes, uncomfortable in the specific way that something feels when it finally fits correctly after you've been holding it wrong for a long time. I said, that's a very precise description. She said, I'm a precise person. I said, I know. She looked at me sideways when I said that. I know. Like it meant something about how long I had been paying attention. It did. We stopped in front of the bookstore on the corner of her block, the small one with the display of used paperbacks in the window, and a handwritten sign on the door that said the owner's hours were suggestions rather than commitments. Mara looked at the window display the way she always did, which was with a kind of evaluative interest, like she was considering each cover for some private criterion. She said, I want to say something before this becomes a thing we talk about with other people. I said, okay. She turned toward me on the sidewalk. She had her coat collar up because it had gotten cold while we walked, and her hair was moving slightly in the wind, and she looked exactly like herself in the clearest, most complete way I could remember. Not a new version of Mara. Mara with the last layer of pretending removed. She said, I am not asking for anything fast. I don't want to wake up tomorrow and feel like we rushed past something that deserved to be taken seriously. We've been something for 6 years, and whatever we're turning into, I wanted to have the same honesty that the other thing had. I said, Mara. She said, let me finish. Because I practiced this a little and I don't want to lose it. I said, okay. She said, I know you, Jake. I know you don't say things unless you mean them, and I know you don't mean things until you're sure. And I'm not asking you to be sure right now. I'm just asking you to stop calling it the wrong name. I looked at her on the sidewalk, with the bookstore window behind her, and the October light doing something flattering to the afternoon, and I thought about what it would feel like to have spent 6 years choosing someone without knowing that's what I was doing. I said, I stopped calling it the wrong name this morning. Her face shifted. When this morning? I said, around the time you told me you needed coffee before the real conversation. That was when I knew you were serious. She said, the coffee was a genuine requirement. I know, I said. That's how I knew. She laughed. Soft, real, the kind that meant the room felt safe, which was the whole thing about Mara. She made rooms feel safe. She had been doing it for 6 years, and I had been calling it friendship, and it was friendship. Completely. All of it. And it was also something that friendship was quietly containing, the way a riverbank contains water. Not stopping it, just giving it a shape. I said, I'm not going to be less myself because this changed. She said, I'm not asking you to be. I said, I'm still going to point out when you're making bad decisions. She said, I depend on that. I said, and if I drive across town in the future, it's going to be with significantly more self-awareness about why I'm doing it. She tilted her head. Only significantly more? I said, I'm working on it. I'm not a therapist. She smiled. No, but you're very good at listening, which is most of what a therapist does. I said, I'm going to tell my sister you said that. She will never let me hear the end of it. Mara looked at me. Your sister has been right for 3 years. I said, we don't need to keep emphasizing that. She bumped her shoulder into mine, which was also something she had always done. and which felt entirely different now in a way that wasn't dramatic, but was real. Then she tucked her hand through my arm, not holding it exactly, just there, and we started walking again. That was the beginning of the honest part. Not a single moment, not a declaration over music, not the locked door or the Sunday coffee, though it was all of those things too. It was more like a slow agreement between two people who had spent 6 years learning each other so well that when they finally looked up, they were already standing somewhere neither of them had consciously walked to. We did not rush. Mara meant what she said about that, and so did I. There was a first actual date 2 weeks later, which she insisted on calling a first actual date, so we both knew what we were doing and couldn't reclassify it as something more casual after the fact. She had strong opinions about context. I had learned to appreciate them. We went to a restaurant that neither of us had been to before, which was Mara's rule. Neutral ground. No existing memories to accidentally slot into the wrong category. She showed up in a green dress, an expression of determined calm that I recognized immediately as the face she used when she was nervous and refusing to perform nervousness for anyone. I told her she looked good. She told me I cleaned up adequately. I said adequately felt precise. She said precision was important. Halfway through dinner, she looked at me across the table and said, "This is strange." I said, "Is it strange bad?" She said, "It's strange because it's also not strange at all, and I don't know what to do with both of those being true at the same time." I said, "I think we just have to sit with both of them." She looked at her plate, then back at me. "I think you're right." Then she smiled. The easy one, the one I'd known for years. "I still hate that you're usually right." I said, "No, you don't." She said, "No, I don't." My sister found out 4 days later. Because my sister has a sixth sense for information, I would prefer to control the timing of. She called on a Wednesday evening, and before I got past hello, she said, "Are you and Mara finally doing something about it?" I said, "What do you mean finally?" She said, "Jake." I said, "We went on a date last week." She was quiet for about 3 seconds, which for my sister is approximately the equivalent of sitting down to write a formal letter. Then she said, "You have got to be kidding me. I have been saying this for 3 years." I said, "You have been saying a version of it for 3 years. You were frequently imprecise." She said, "I said you needed to either date Mara or explain to yourself why you weren't. That is extremely precise." I said, "Mara sends her regards." She made a sound that communicated satisfaction, vindication, and the strong intention to bring this up at every future family gathering. 2 months after the Sunday with the locked door and the coffee and the honest conversation, I was at Mara's apartment on a Thursday night. Not because anything was wrong, not because she had texted that things were too quiet, just because I wanted to be there, and that was reason enough now without needing another name for it. She was at the counter, already making coffee. I came in, put my bag down, and sat on the stool at the counter island. She put a mug in front of me without being asked. I said thank you. She said obviously. We were watching a documentary about cave diving later, and she said something that made me laugh so hard. I knocked my mug, slightly sideways, and she grabbed it before anything spilled, which she did in the quick, specific way of someone who knew exactly how I moved. Without looking, without thinking, just from knowing. I said, "Mara." She said, "What?" I said, "I just wanted to say." She looked at me from the other side of the coffee mugs with her hair pulled up and the thrift store lamp glowing in the corner, in the counter, and that particular warmth that her apartment had always had and that I now understood was at least partly her. I said, "I should have figured this out 2 years ago." She considered it. "Possibly three?" I said, "Definitely not three. I was not ready 3 years ago." She said, "I know. Neither was I." She tilted her head slightly. "I was ready in March, though." I said, "The night we talked until past 1?" She said, "Yes." I knew in March, and then I waited 8 months trying to figure out how to say it. I said, "And your method was inviting me to stay the night and then locking the door." She picked up her mug. "It worked," I said. "It was a genuinely unusual approach." She said, "I'm a creative problem solver." I looked at her across the counter. She looked back at me. The refrigerator hummed. The lamp made everything warm. Outside, the city went on being the city, loud and indifferent, and inside her apartment, the whole complicated, unremarkable human miracle of two people finally getting the translation right sat between us, like something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time. I said, I love you, Mara. She put the mug down. Her face did something real and quiet and completely her own. She said, I've been waiting for you to say that for a while. I said, I know. I was being thorough. She came around the counter and sat beside me on the stool, close enough that I could tell she was smiling even when I wasn't looking at her. She said, Jake? I said, yeah. She said, you're allowed to be less thorough now. I said, I'll try. She said, also the documentary is about to get to the part where they find the underwater cave and I need you to react correctly when you see it. I said, what's the correct reaction? She said, exactly the one I'm expecting. You'll know it when we get there. I said, that's not helpful. She said, you'll be fine. I held out my hand. She looked at it for a second, the same way she had looked at her locked door the night I found out what it meant. Like she was making sure, like she was choosing and not just falling. Then she put her hand in mine. The documentary played. The cave was incredible. I reacted correctly, apparently because she didn't say anything critical. The lamp stayed warm in the corner. The coffee went cold because it always did when we got talking. And somewhere in the ordinary middle of a Thursday evening, 6 years after it quietly started, we figured out what we had actually been building. What would you have done if your best friend asked you to stay the night and then locked their door? And have you ever used distance to say something you didn't have words for yet? Tell me in the comments. If this one meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.